Earlier this spring and summer, Pakistan was hit with a series of intense heat waves. In May, sweltering temperatures topped 123 degrees in some parts. This unusual and prolonged extreme heat, coupled with low rainfall, caused water shortages and killed off thousands of crops. Fast forward to last month, and the nation again saw extreme weather, except this time it was record flooding. For 8 weeks straight, there was non-stop rain, leading to 1/3 of all land submerged in water, according to Pakistan's National Disaster Management Authority. And it didn't end there. Powerful walls of waves and strong currents swept away homes, cars, and people. Over 1 million houses were damaged, and the death toll from this flooding has now exceeded 1,500 people. 1/3 of those killed were children. In the wake of this dangerous heat and devastating flooding, Pakistanis are struggling to pick up the pieces, and they're not alone.
The heat that started there then was also present in China. They had the most severe heat wave on record and also one of the most severe droughts. So they too have been having to really cut back on their hydropower generation. And while that's going on in Asia, over in Europe, they had unprecedented record-breaking heat and drought that started at the beginning of the year and has continued right on to present. Fortunately, getting a little rain in August, but it's still really dire in Europe.
That's Jonathan Overpeck, a climate scientist and the dean of the School for Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan. Even thousands of miles from these tragic events, here at home in the western U.S., the shifting climate is also having dire impacts.
There's a drought going on there that has gone on for 23 years, and it is the worst drought in recorded history, recorded by instrumental records. It is something we call a mega drought because it's lasted over 2 decades. It is the first mega drought that the United States has experienced since the country was founded. It is being driven largely by the intersection of natural climate variability and climate change. So climate change is making it much worse, both in terms of reducing the precipitation that's falling across much of the Southwest, but also in terms of the warmer temperatures that we now have, which are causing things to dry out much more severely than they would have decades ago.
This summer especially, California and other surrounding western states have been engulfed in extreme heat and drought. Now, some experts are warning that the area is at an increased risk of catastrophic flooding in the near future. One researcher that's sounding the alarm is Daniel Swain, a climate scientist at the University of California, Los Angeles, and the Nature Conservancy. Swain studies how global warming factors into increasing regional climate extremes.
The number one thing that matters, both with respect to the risk of increasing extreme precipitation events and intensifying droughts, sometimes in the same places, is the fact that as the atmosphere warms, its ability to hold water vapor increases exponentially, even for relatively steady, incremental, linear warming. And so as that water vapor holding capacity of the atmosphere increases, it essentially makes the atmosphere act like an increasingly large sponge with each degree of warming. What that means in practice is that the ceiling on how intense precipitation can become is rising rapidly, right along with that exponential increase in the water vapor holding capacity. And in other words, even if precipitation isn't increasing on average, the very most intense precipitation events are becoming more intense.
And it's not just flooding that gets more severe as temperatures rise. Swain says that water shortages are also worsening because of this warmer atmosphere that's able to hold on to more moisture.
By virtue of being a bigger sponge, it can also absorb more water from the landscape. And so the increased water vapor holding capacity of the atmosphere, unless you're getting a lot more precipitation on average, which in places like California and the Southwest we're not, that drives increased evaporative demand. Essentially, it increases the propensity of the atmosphere to act as that giant sponge, extracting more and more water from the landscape, evaporating water from the soil, from bodies of water, and melting snowpack.
Overpeck points out that the flooding in Pakistan was especially intense because it's also home to a large number of glaciers.
Because of the Himalayan mountains, there are more glaciers in Pakistan than just about any other country outside of the polar regions. Because of all this early warming in Pakistan, starting as early as March and April, these glaciers were melting much harder and faster than ever before. And that meltwater coincided with the summer monsoon. So you had this 1-2 punch of unusually volumes of meltwater from the glaciers coinciding with this unusually climate change supercharged monsoon. And that completely flooded the whole country like it's never seen before. And these are the kind of disasters that will befall Pakistan over and over. But it will also see it in other parts of Asia where the glaciers and the monsoon are interacting. And of course, even where there are no glaciers, we're going to see unusually severe rainfall and flooding.
In light of these new challenges, experts like Swain are mapping out solutions that involve both climate adaptation and climate mitigation. So, what's the difference between these two strategies, and is one more important than the other?
Climate mitigation being reducing greenhouse gas emissions, eventually bringing them to zero to solve the underlying problem of global warming, which is caused by the increasing concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, primarily caused by humans. Climate adaptation being essentially learning to live to a certain extent with the kinds of changes that we've already seen in the world with respect to climate and extreme events, and the changes that we're likely to see in the next few decades as the Earth continues to warm. So one is solving the underlying problem, and one is making the underlying problem less bad by reducing the consequences of it. We need to be doing a heck of a lot of both of these things if we want to really create a world where we aren't constantly plagued by escalating climate disasters. And it kind of feels like that's where we're starting to head right now. We're working from behind the curve in both respects. We haven't done enough mitigation or enough adaptation at this point.
Take California, for example. Swain says scientists are developing climate adaptation solutions that help manage both the risks of severe drought and severe flooding facing the region. One key approach is to store more water in underground aquifers.
This might mean moving water well in advance of a flood into areas where it can recharge by gradually percolating back into those aquifers. That gives us a little bit more breathing room because we can keep reservoir levels lower, which is safer when the big storms come, because it means you just have more headroom, more flood control space to work with. So there are some things we could potentially do that would benefit both drought resilience and flood resilience in the same adaptation strategy.
It's solutions like these that can help with the effects of climate change in the short term. But the reality is that humans may have to abandon certain cities and regions as the climate evolves and the land becomes unlivable. In the end, both Swain and Overpeck agree that human engineering and climate adaptation are not enough alone. More widespread solutions that mitigate future climate change must be taken.
There's real hope here. What we just have to do as humankind is switch over to the renewable energy and the clean tech solutions that will stop climate change. We have to do this faster because the longer it takes, the more rainfall will intensify, the more droughts and heat waves will get worse. So it's really on us to accelerate our actions to stop climate change.
To find out more about this topic and our guests, Jonathan Overpeck and Daniel Swain, visit viewpointsradio.org. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zavarin. I'm Gary Price. Coming up on Viewpoints.
Workers are finding that even under all this pressure, working for a company that's making an immense amount of money, they have to choose at the end of the month between groceries or rent.
Better understanding the current labor revolt. Then,
I'm saying, go ahead. The world will see what you're going to do. The Power of Photography During the Civil Rights Movement. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.